Support for this week's episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Diller Teen Tikkun Olam Awards. Applications and nominations are open now. The Diller Teen Tikkun Olam Awards honor up to 15 Jewish teens from across the United States with an award of $36,000 to recognize their impact and leadership to repair the world. Nominate a teen today, or they can apply directly by January 5th. Learn more at dillerteenawards.org. That's DILLER teenawards.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 346, Yom Kippur, the Power of Regret. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rothberg.
And our guest today is Daniel H. Pink, the best-selling author of many books, including the one that came out earlier this year that's the subject of today's conversation, which is called The Power of Regret. Now, before we jump into that conversation, just a few quick announcements because you might regret it if you don't listen to these announcements and act on them. The first is to consider making a high holiday contribution to Judaism Unbound. Many synagogues and other organizations have a Yom Kippur appeal, a financial appeal that comes right before the holiday of Yom Kippur, often with some notion that it'll help you be inscribed and sealed in the book of life. We are not going to go that far and claim that any supernatural rewards or punishments will come to you whether or not you make this donation, but it will help us a lot if you do. So if you have been listening to Judaism Unbound all year, you've appreciated our ongoing discussion of the Shemitah year last year, or if you just generally like the show and appreciate what we're doing, please consider a donation, whether it's $18 or $18,000, whatever you can afford. It helps a lot and will allow us to continue doing this work. You can do that at www.judaismunbound.com/donate, and we really thank you for that, and we really appreciate it, and are wishing you just the happiest of New Year's and a meaningful high holiday season. And the second announcement we want to make is that together with Chazon, the Jewish environmental organization, we are rebooting an old tradition and making it new again. It's called Hakel, and it is a gathering that takes place on the Sukkot that follows the Shemitah year. Traditionally, what happened at the Hakel gathering was that the entire Torah was read. So we're going to do a version of that where the entire Torah is going to be read in English over the course of the day, and people that are there in the Zoom room are going to be able to chat with one another with their own commentaries, interpretations, thoughts, etc., as the Torah is being read. That is going to start as early as 4 a.m. Eastern Time. We're not quite sure yet because we have to figure out how long it takes to read the entire Torah. And then it is going to conclude just before 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Pacific Time, and at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we are going to gather together with Chazon for a more formal event that is going to include all kinds of ritual and conversation and discussion. We'll have more to say about this event next week, but in the meantime, if you're interested in signing up to potentially attend the event, just go to the following website, bit.ly, that's bit.ly/Hakel 2022. That's HAKHEL 2022. And now let's turn to our conversation with our guest today. Daniel H. Pink is a New York Times bestselling author of many books, including A Whole New Mind, When, The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing, and the #1 New York Times bestseller, Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. His latest book, which we thought was really appropriate to discuss right before the high holidays, in particular Yom Kippur, is called The Power of Regret, How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. In addition to writing these best-selling books, Daniel Pink has been a contributing editor at Fast Company and Wired, as well as a business columnist for the Sunday Telegraph. He's published articles and essays in the New York Times, the Harvard Business Review, the Atlantic, Slate, and other publications. And before he started writing his own stuff, Daniel Pink was the chief speechwriter for Vice President Al Gore from 1995 to 1997. Daniel H. Pink, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's a great thrill to have you.
I'm so glad to be here.
Well, I have to say that your book, The Power of Regret, was the book that I read last year. That I have a list of books that I read, and I start it as, this is one of the important ones. Like this is one of those books that really made me think this year. In fact, we've talked a lot about reimagining the Jewish holidays, and in some ways, I don't know if there are other cultures that have a holiday devoted to regrets, and some might argue that that's not really what Yom Kippur is. But if we were to imagine that a holiday devoted to regret would be a good thing, I'd like to start by asking you to define regret as you're thinking about it in this book, and also to talk a little bit about why having a holiday devoted to regret or really focusing on regret would be a good thing, because I think a lot of people think of that being a bad thing and, oh, you shouldn't have regrets. Don't focus so much on your regrets. Why is that a good thing?
Okay, well, let me take the definition first. So regret is an emotion. It's emotion that makes us feel bad when we look backward and imagine, if only I had done that thing that I didn't do, if only I didn't do the thing that I actually did do, if I only had done something in a different way. So it's counterfactual thinking, where we imagine how we could have done something different or better. And it is a remarkably common emotion. It is one of the most common emotions that human beings experience. It is arguably the most common unpleasant negative emotion that human beings experience. It is ubiquitous in the human experience. And the reason that it's ubiquitous is because if we've done it right, it's useful. And the problem is, and this is, I think, where we come into Yom Kippur, or we come into other, even a whole array of other faith traditions, is that especially in secular society, we don't have processes, mechanisms, rituals to contend with regret, to contend with that kind of negative emotion. And what the science tells us, and we have 60 years of research into this emotion, what the science tells us is that we shouldn't ignore our regrets. That's the no regrets thing, Dan, that you were just talking about. We shouldn't wallow in our regrets. We should confront our regrets in a systematic way. Tell me, do you think, Dan or Lex, is Yom Kippur a holiday about regret?
A lot of times we try to reject that question of what is an element of Judaism and talk more about, like, well, what could it be? What could it become? Does it have the bones for it? And I think you could say that Yom Kippur is a lot of things, but what really intrigued me when I was reading your book was to say, well, what would it be like if Yom Kippur was a holiday about regret? And how could that be? Like, I think a lot of people would hear that and say, oh, that's so depressing. Why would you want to make Judaism even more depressing? But no, that's what it was really intriguing to me about your book, is to say, well, what would a holiday be like if it was about regret, but in a forward-looking way, in a positive, in a way that makes you benefit from that regret?
I think that is possible. I'm not sure that it necessarily needs to be a holiday rather than a kind of a regular practice. But let's go with, what would a holiday devoted to regret look like? So first of all, it would begin with a degree of self-compassion that is often absent in the way that many religious traditions talk about misdeeds, sin. So a holiday devoted to regret would begin with treating ourselves with kindness rather than contempt. All right. And that's an extraordinarily important thing in making sense of our regrets. Treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. Understand that your regrets are part of the human condition. The reason we have this holiday devoted to regret is that we all experience regret. It's ubiquitous. It's part of the human condition. And also that any individual misdeed or mistake is a moment in your life, not the full measure of your life. So that I think that any holiday devoted to regret would begin with that inward examination. And then there are other steps that we can do too.
I want to sit with what you said about, holiday versus ongoing practice.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in that. And I want to think about it in the context of Yom Kippur, but also just generally with all holidays. I am definitely a holiday backer, big holiday fan here.
Go for it. Yeah.
And the reason is not just, well, it's partially because I just like having parties and I don't want to say that's not part of it. That's certainly part of it. Yom Kippur is not really a party day, although there are texts that imply it is a joy day, which surprises a lot of people. But anyway, I'll choose an example that's not a Jewish holiday, but just like birthdays. I think it is a worthwhile human process or thing to reflect on one's aging, to reflect on where one is in their life now, where they were a few years ago, where they and I think that all of us, maybe not all of us, almost everybody probably agrees with that. But I think if we didn't have a tradition of marking birthdays, whatever ability we would have to achieve that would be less than where we are, because we do mark birthdays. And I'm not saying everybody is like super deliberate when, I turned 31, I'm soon going to turn 32. Like, I'm not saying it's like this huge process where people like write up big intentions, but I do think there's a natural thing of like, oh, where was my birthday party last year? Was I living somewhere else? Was I doing something else? What's changed? What's the same? Like, I think that just naturally happens because we have a cultural thing of marking birthdays. And so while in the abstract, I would strive for a world where I personally and the communities I'm a part of are like thinking about regret. I do think actually sort of establishing a moment in the year or a season in the year where we extra do that might be worthwhile. But like, that's my take. I'm curious, like, when you think about, this is not what your book is so much. It's not like a autobiographical thing, but like when you think about your own regrets, I'm kind of curious like how you go about it and whether you've drawn on lessons from the studies that are cited in your book from your own thinking.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that, Lex. I think you make a really good argument. And the other part about that, though, is that the idea of regular practice and holiday, those things are not mutually exclusive. One can do both. And I do think that there is something to be said for those markers, those rituals. Again, let's come back to what I was talking about before. Like Catholicism has a ritual, a set of practices dealing with not so much directly with regret, but dealing with something akin to sin. And Yom Kippur is about misdeeds or sin or things you need to atone for. And I think that's healthy. I mean, and if you think about in the Catholic tradition, what are you doing? You are, first of all, you are disclosing. And what we know from a lot of research is that disclosure itself is valuable. So you're disclosing, and at the very least, there's a ritual that you can go through, a process you can go through. And I think that is actually one of the strengths of any religious tradition, to some extent, even secular traditions, that give people a sense of meaning, that give people a sense of where they are on the calendar, that give people something comfortable that they can rely on. And I think that's one of the reasons that that religion very clearly contributes to overall well-being. I mean, if you look at the research, people who have religious faith, who regularly go to religious services, they are, in general, on average, happier and healthier than people who do not. Part of it goes to the ritual, the sense of purpose, the sense making that comes with rituals. I think part of it comes to being part of a community that they care about and that cares about them. I'm an intensely, devoutly secular person. I was raised in a very Jewish household, as it happens. But as a devoutly secular person, I am a scientific person, and the evidence is overwhelming that religious faith is helpful to people. And so I'm not, I don't like this. This is where I part ways with the professional atheists out there who are saying that anybody who believes in God is an idiot. Anybody who practices religion is a fool, is deluding themselves. I don't believe that for a second.
Well, yeah, and I feel like one of the things that is our agenda, certainly is my agenda on this show, is work with somebody like you to figure out what we can learn from those religious practices, if not the beliefs, and to say, well, actually, they were onto something. Is there a way to experience this as a secular person, in this case, as a secular Jew, where we might go through some of the same ritual practices, or we might introduce new ones that would actually get at what we're trying to get at? Just giving you one example, this is more about Rosh Hashanah than Yom Kippur, but one of the Torah readings for Rosh Hashanah is the binding of Isaac. And as I was reading your book, I was thinking, like, how amazing would it be to have that Torah reading, but to present it as probably this was Abraham's greatest regret, and he screwed up his relationship with his son, which, by the way, there's a lot of commentary that suggests that that's the case. And their relationship was never the same. And really what we should be thinking about is not how devoted Abraham was in this moment to God, but how he might have been able to repair that relationship with his son over the rest of their life. And there are things like that happen in the synagogue on these holidays that, as I was reading your book, I was thinking, there's this part where you kind of beat your breast and you say all of these things, all of these sins that we've done, but they all were kind of sins of commission. And one of the things that you brought up in your book was how important a lot of regrets are about omissions, like about things that you didn't do when you could have done them. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the taxonomy of those regrets and how they are different and how the repair of them is different.
Sure. But I am ultimately going to steer this back to reimagining some of these holidays, because it just made me think about something else. But Dan, you make a very good point. This is actually extremely important in understanding this emotion of regret, which is in the architecture of regret. There is this fundamental distinction between regrets of action and regrets of inaction. Regrets about what I did. I bullied somebody. I cheated on my spouse. I hurt somebody, versus regrets of inaction. I didn't ask that person out on a date. I didn't call my old friend. One of the big, in fact, to me, the only stark demographic difference in regret is on this front, which is that when people are young, they have about equal numbers of regrets of action and inaction. But over time, inaction regrets take over. I'm in my 50s. When you're my age, people in their 50s generally 2-to-1, sometimes 3-to-1 ratio of regrets of inaction to action. And so what really sticks with us are those regrets of inaction. And I think that when we think about misdeeds, when we think about, or to put a fine point on it, I don't, there's something about the word sin just doesn't sit with me very well. But if we think about, but let's use it anyway. We think about sins are, I think they're largely action rather than inaction. Wouldn't you agree?
That's a really interesting question. I think that traditionally, when discussing them in Jewish tradition, I do think it's mostly things you did that like went astray. But you're opening up for me whether that's always the case.
My hunch, and it's only a hunch, is that it's mostly the case. But let's come back to something that we're saying. Let's imagine a holiday. I found what Lex said about the argument for a holiday actually pretty persuasive. I think it's a really good point. And I think that the holiday would be, if devoted to regret, would be different from the way that Yom Kippur is traditionally observed, which is about essentially self-laceration, self-abnegation. I'm going to, in order to feel the pain, in order to repent, in order to atone, I'm going to not eat for 24 hours. I think what the psychological literature tells us is that intense kind of self-criticism, self-abnegation is not actually that effective. But neither is this approach, like you're good at the kind of like the gooey, syrupy self-help tradition of boosting your self-esteem. What is useful is self-compassion. And so one can imagine a secular tradition of regret in which people don't fast. What they do is that they have a meal together and they talk about their regrets. They disclose their regrets to make sense of them. And they enlist the community. They enlist other people's help in extracting lessons from them and finding a way forward. That to me would be a lovely holiday devoted to regret.
Yeah, and just as one quick example, I was thinking, again, as I was reading your book, I was imagining this holiday, and I was imagining that like something really valuable could be that like older people in the community come up and talk about their regrets. Specifically, I was thinking about the categories that you have of foundational regrets, which is like I didn't do enough things when I was younger to build this foundation for the rest of my life, or boldness regrets where somebody says, there was a risk I should have taken and I didn't take it. And those are the kind of regrets that, I think a lot about Judaism, and I've talked about Judaism as a wisdom tradition. And what I mean by wisdom is that wisdom is the kind of knowledge that we generally acquire through the school of hard knocks. But if we acquire it only through the school of hard knocks, we've generally acquired it too late. And so that's what the older people are desperate to pass on to the younger people. So you don't end up with the same regrets as me. And I was thinking, like, what would that look like if it was ritualized?
It's very interesting you say that, Dan, because one very specific regret that comes out just for your listeners, let me take a step back. I studied this emotion of regret in 3 different ways. One, as I mentioned earlier, looking at about 60 years of science, social psychology, neuroscience, cognitive science, developmental psychology. I also did a very large public opinion survey of U.S. attitudes about regret. The other thing that I did, though, was I collected regrets from around the world. And we now have a database of over 22,000 regrets from people in 109 countries. It's unbelievable. It's just an incredible collection of human aspiration and longing and emotion and so forth. The reason I give that prelude is that when you go into that third body of research, those 22,000 regrets, one thing that comes up with a very specific regret that comes up is people saying, I wish I had recorded or captured my grandparents' stories or elder person's stories. And I think that the holiday you're suggesting actually scratches that itch in a way, that I do think there is a kind of a yearning out there. The yearning is often sort of retrospective yearning once the opportunity has passed. But I do think that there is a demand for that. So you could have, I can see that being ritualized in some way.
First off, on the 22,000, I'm like doing a deep dive into the book of Numbers for a course I'm teaching. 22,000 is the number of Levites that are counted in the census. It's like, so
Get out, really?
Yeah, it's well, so it's interesting. There's 22,000 at one point, and then there's 22,300. It seems to disagree with itself in the text. There's like a serious problem because it's not consistent, and a lot of commentators go nuts with why. But anyway, I wanted to bring up some of the, I don't know what to call them, because I think in terms that are religious, I was going to say parables.
Yeah.
But there are some like anecdotes, stories, ideas in your book that have been used in studies that I'm thinking are worth bringing up. First off, there's an opening story where, towards the beginning of your book, where there are these two, I forget if they're brothers or friends or something, and they each go to school every day by bike. And there's like a lake that they have to go around. And it's like a perfectly circular lake. So you could go to the right or you could go to the left and it would be exactly the same distance. And one of them always goes to the left and one of them always goes to the right. And one day, the one who goes to the right, like instead decides to go to the left. And there's like a pothole or something that he stumbles and hurts himself. And the other person who always goes to the left just went to the left again. So both of them go the same way. Who would feel more regret? The one who like made a weird change to their life and then hit this obstacle, or the one who, just because they always go that way, they hit this obstacle? And of course, in reading that, for me, I'm reading that and I'm like, oh, well, the person who makes the random spur of the moment shift in their life and hits a pothole the first time they do that, they're going to feel like, oh, I should have gone the way I always do. But the person who just kept doing their normal routine and hit a pothole, that's just like, oh, unlucky. Like there was a pothole that wasn't there the day before and I hit it. Like there was nothing really for me to do differently. So it's harder for me to regret that. But what's funny is I read that and I backed out and I'm like, I actually think that there's a teaching there. Like it's almost like when you have other casino examples. Like if you pull a slot machine and lose and the person next to you pulls a slot machine and wins. They didn't do a better thing than you did. You just got unlucky and the person next to you got lucky. I found myself thinking like maybe the healthy thing is to recognize that a lot of this is kind of arbitrary. And when we apply that regret selectively, it doesn't always work. But my takeaway is not regret's bad. My takeaway is we should almost like strive to feel regret in both situations. If that like both people who went around the lake should feel some regret. Because the regret is just pointing that there was another possibility. They could have gone another direction. And knowing that there's multiple ways to go to school in the morning is like a good thing to think about and could affect their future decisions.
It is an interesting example because it's basically a scenario they give to people. It's a story in developmental psychology used to test the development of regret in children. So children who are only 5 years old don't understand why one might be more regretful than the other because they can't do that.
And they're kind of right is what I'm getting at. Like they're wrong and they're right.
But exactly. I think it's a really interesting point. But the question that they're asking is who would feel more regret? All right. Not who deservedly feels more regret, but who would feel more regret. So it's basic. It's a little bit of kind of a theory of the mind test, but it's also a test of counterfactual thinking. And that's really, to me, like there's a boundary around that particular parable because it's used essentially for that one purpose. That said, I think there is something bigger lurking inside of that tale, which is questions about our agency. What do we have control over and what do we not have control over? How much is our own individual action and how much is circumstance and luck and fortune? And that is a perennial, fundamental question. And it's a question that we have contradictory views on. Case in point. In the public opinion survey that I described, I asked people a question about free will. Do you think in general people have free will? They have control over what they do, how they do it, et cetera, et cetera. We had something like 78% of people said yes. Then I said, do you think that everything in life happens? And later in the survey, do you think everything in life happens for a reason? Okay, fatalistic view. 78% of people said yes. So basically, the vast majority of people believe that they have agency, they have free will, and that everything happens for a reason. I'm sort of coming to the conclusion that Lex came to with the 5-year-olds. Maybe they're kind of right. It's like my first instinct was that's idiotic. Those are totally contradictory. And then I'm saying, well, actually, maybe they're not. Maybe that is a healthy approach to living in sort of teasing out what, trying to figure out what do you have control over, what do you not? And at certain circumstances for psychological health, seeing the positive side of misfortune. But I found that contradiction very interesting. And I think that the question is, what do we have control over, and what do we not that we don't have control over? And so, for instance, back to your example, the kid who drove the bike the same way, the same path, and the tree fell in the path, he can't feel regret because regret requires agency. He's feeling disappointment. He's disappointed that happened, but he can't feel regret because regret requires agency. There's so many, and the difference between regret and disappointment are vast. Anybody who's a sports fan understands this. It's like I'm a Washingtonian. I'm a fan of Washington sports teams, except for our football team, whom I despise because I hate the owner. But let's take the Washington Wizards basketball team, or the Nationals. Okay, the Washington Nationals baseball team. All right, we have one of the worst records in the major leagues. All right, every time I look at a game, we lose, and that bothers me. It's weird that it bothers me, but I can't feel. That emotion isn't regret because I don't play. I don't own the team. It's disappointment. If it's raining outside, I can feel disappointment, but I can't feel regret because I didn't make it rain. I can feel regret if I go outside and don't bring an umbrella. That's on me. And so I think this idea of teasing out where we have agency and where we don't is so fundamental to healthy living. And I do think that religious traditions can help people sort that out. I really do. I don't think that life is fatalistic at all, but I think there are limits to our agency. And when there are limits to our agency, that can be kind of psychologically terrifying. Religion can be a healthy balm for that psychological terror.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because just the example that you were using, I didn't make it rain, so I can't have regret over that. One of the things that I've been thinking about lately is, in terms of the limitations of the religious orientation, is that there are things that the founders of various religions imagined that human beings didn't have agency over, that either it turns out that we did or we do now. Right. And I'm wondering whether
very
that's
interesting. Yeah.
become a limit, whether we actually should, one of the things that Jewish holidays could do is say, hey, by the way, it is your fault that it rained, not because God punished you, but because you've been spewing fossil fuels
and not
into
your
the air.
individual fault, but like collective.
Yeah,
Right.
your collective. Yeah,
but I think that those are all worthy questions. I think those are all worthy questions to ask. The other thing interesting, maybe for your listeners, I'll throw in here is that so in this public opinion survey, I asked a number of demographic questions to see if there were demographic differences. I asked questions, for instance, I had people self-identify as introvert and extrovert, saying, are there differences between what extroverts regret and introverts regret? Beep. No difference. I asked people about belief in God because I was convinced that belief in God was going to drive people's attitudes toward regret. No difference. Largely because everybody in America believes in God. The number of people who I guess I live in a rarefied NPR listening world, but I was not shocked. I was surprised at the numbers that we got on belief in God. We gave people a choice. We said, I believe in God. I do not believe in God. I'm not sure if I believe in God. And it was something like 75% said they believe in God. And very few people said that they didn't believe in God, which is fine. And then a surprising number of people said, I'm not sure. Because I guess people don't like to be unsure.
So I'm glad you brought up sports because I was thinking about sports like the entire time I read your book. I can't articulate exactly why, but there's just, first off, there were connections to sports. You talked about Olympians and how in many ways getting a silver medal is less beneficial to people's health than getting a bronze medal, because when you get a silver medal, you're thinking about how you almost got the gold medal. And when you get a bronze medal, you're thinking, oh, at least I got a bronze medal. You use those words at least a lot as sort of a positive indicator. At least I achieved X in life as opposed to nothing, versus I almost achieved this amazing thing, but I fell short, which is like the silver medal feeling. But I was thinking about sports constantly because something about when I play sports, I think lends itself to what in my mind are like small, healthy regrets. Like if people were to ask me what I believe sports are good for, I have a lot of answers, especially in playing sports. I think when I go and play disc golf, which is the individual sport I play most frequently, but even if I go bowling or something, when I throw a poor shot,
I'm going to resist the Talmudic argument that would take issue that disc golf and bowling are actually sports. But I'll leave that for now.
The
Talmudic argument is built around the very safe claim that in neither sport is there defense.
I would say that there could be wind and oil pattern that are serving the role of defense in disc golf and bowling. But
well done, Rabbi. Well done.
But so if I throw part of why disc golf is for me the go-to example, because that's what I play most frequently. But even for people who don't know what that is, bowling, golf, pick your individual sport. I multiple times in a row do something that I would say, like in quotes, regret, right? Like, and I don't mean that in a big life regret sense, but like, I'll throw a bowling shot. My tendency in bowling is to not follow through and miss a shot to the right. I very rarely miss to the left. I'm a right-handed person and I don't follow through, and so it just sort of leaks out to the right.
Okay.
I have a little mini regret that I should have followed through.
Yeah.
And then the next, like, I would venture a guess that if you took a sample size of all my shots after I missed to the right, my shot directly after that is probably better than my average shot, because I am actively telling myself,
follow through, you jackass.
And so I do. And I noticed that some of your sports examples were really evocative for me, because you talked about that medalist feeling of sort of not quite achieving something, but actually how not quite achieving something or missing the mark in some way can actually be precisely what gets you on track. You have to miss the same way a few times to recognize the pattern and know how to not miss as much, if that makes sense.
Let me take a step back and talk about this if only and at least distinction. As I mentioned earlier, regret is a form of counterfactual thinking. One of the great things about our minds, our brains, is that we can conjure events that go counter to the actual facts. There are two kinds of counterfactual thinking. One is known as a downward counterfactual, where you imagine how things could have been worse. I shouldn't have married Ed, but at least I have these two great kids. All right, it could have been worse. And downward counterfactuals at least make us feel better. That's why those bronze medalists, study after study after study, showing that when you look at the facial expressions of medalists, bronze medalists are freaking happy. They're happier than silver medalists. Why? They're doing a downward counterfactual. And at least I didn't finish fourth like that schmo who didn't get the medal. Another kind of counterfactual is an upward counterfactual, where we imagine how things could have been better. If only I had married Esteban, I would be living in a much nicer community than I'm living in now. If only I had pedaled faster, I would have won the gold medal rather than this crappy silver medal. All right. Upward counterfactuals, if only, make us feel worse. But done right, they can help us do better. Right. Let's take your example, Lex. I'm going to quote back your immortal words. Follow through, dumbass. That was what you said in the bowling scenario there. What's happening there? You didn't follow through. You felt bad about that. All right. You said, if only I had followed through, I would have thrown a strike rather than whatever I did in my bad bowling turn. But if onlys can help us do better if we treat them right. And sports is instructive here. When you think about this, every professional athlete in every sport watches game film. They go back and look at their mistakes. They don't necessarily, I don't think it's a great idea to regularly call yourself a dumbass. There's very little value in it. But what they do is that they don't say, oh my God, I threw an interception. No regrets. I don't look backward. I'm always positive. That's not how you improve. Nor do they say, oh, I threw an interception. I am the worst quarterback there ever was. I don't deserve to put on a helmet and go out on the field. I'm just completely worthless. They say, I threw an interception. Let's go look at the tape. What did I do wrong? That feels pretty bad. How can I learn from that and do better? And I think in outside of sports, we have this idea that saying no regrets, I don't have any regrets, no regrets, is like as a sign of courage. But it's not courage. That's performed courage. Real courage is looking your regrets in the eye and doing something about them.
Can we talk about the flip side of this coin? Because a lot of times when we start talking about regrets and people shouldn't live with no regrets and there's a good and a power of regret, I'm into it. And then I think about the people in my life, and there are quite a few who tend to just live in constant regret. And I'm wondering what we learn from the research that you've done on what should those people be doing differently in order to not have experienced that and have the people around them experience that as this just constant negative emotion?
I think the main reason, not necessarily the only reason, but the main reason for that is that they don't know how to contend with that negative feeling. And the way you contend with that negative feeling is, as I mentioned before, is through self-compassion. Treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. And the other thing is that we take these missteps that happen in like little, in a day, in a moment, and we use that to define ourselves fully. That's a bad idea. That self-compassion can arrest the march to rumination. And I think that what's happening there is that many of those people are not they're treating themselves with contempt. They're not treating themselves with kindness. That's necessary, but not sufficient. The other thing, and again, we can go back to the Catholic tradition, which I think is built on in this case, built on good research, which is this: emotions, by their very nature, are abstract. They're blobby. They're vaporous. That's what makes positive emotions feel good, but it's what makes negative emotions feel bad. And so what happens is that those people you're describing, Dan, they're immersed in this kind of cloud, this vapor of negative feeling. So when we talk about our regrets, when we write about our regrets, it's a transmutation of sorts. We're converting that abstraction into concrete words. Those are less menacing. When I look at this kind of vaporous thing, that's kind of menacing. When I see a sentence I've written or said, well, wait a second, that's actually not that menacing. And then, we have to have systematic ways to draw lessons from it. But I think that in most cases, not in all cases, because, obviously in a few cases, you have people with a physiological disorder that is giving them a propensity to ruminate or to be depressed or something like that. But in most cases, it's because people don't know what to do. They feel that spear of negativity. And because they've been sold a bill of goods that we have to be positive all the time, they say, oh, I feel pretty bad. Wow, everybody else is so positive and perfect. There must be something wrong with me. And that's a colossal mistake.
So I have a question around, we've used the word counterfactual a lot, and it's a very important word for our podcast in many ways. We definitely dwell in counterfactuals, not so much for like us as individuals, like, oh, I could have done X differently, but in many ways, one of the core projects of our podcast is to look at the Jewish past and say, it happened this way. History played out in X, Y, or Z way. And so now we have this set of holidays. They're observed this way, whatever. But it could have gone all sorts of other ways. For us at least, it's not like divinely ordained. And I'm using those words on purpose. Like it's not divinely ordained that Yom Kippur is the way it is, or that any holiday is the way it is, or that, our American Jewish community is structured the way it is, that certain beliefs are centered and others are marginalized, that certain people are centered and others are marginalized. Like none of that is necessarily ordained. And so the act of sort of asking the counterfactual about our past, the asking of that question for collectives to be like, how could we have been different? How could we be different? How might we have more agency, to use a word in your book? How might we actually have a lot of agency to shape our future? Because people in the past had agency too. Like, I think that's really important. So I kind of wanted to zoom out, because I don't want people to listen to you and hear that like counterfactual is a dirty word. I don't think that's what you're saying. And I'm curious, basically, like your book mostly, as I read it, is about individuals and their regrets about and their singular they like their like the ways that each person thinks about my life, his life, her life, their life. To what extent would you sort of map the lessons onto more collective regrets? Like, to what extent might it be the same for communities like Jews or other communities of people to sort of look back on history and regret things, or say, woe is me, or say, wow, we actually, the at least, like, we actually did achieve this as a group. It could have been worse. And to what extent might it not actually be a smooth layering? And might we have to ask different questions when we're saying how, like, groups of people reflect on regret? Yeah.
It's a really interesting question. And you're right, as you say, counterfactual is not a dirty word. It's a human word. Human beings engage in counterfactual thinking. It's one of the great capacities of our brain. It helps us. Counterfactual thinking, in some ways, is the engine that drives many narratives, many stories, including religious stories. Now, I think the question of collective counterfactual thinking or collective regret sense making is actually really intriguing. And to some extent, here in the United States, we're having a fight over that. I'll give you what I think is the best case in point from recent history, which is South Africa. All right, Nelson Mandela, imprisoned for decades, comes in and becomes president of this country, where for decades a white minority, held the black majority under its heel. Suddenly, the black majority is in power. Now, Mandela could have extracted vengeance, but you know what he did? He established this thing. I think it's a landmark moment in the recent history of human beings. Established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to establish the truth of what really happened. We're trying to reconcile it and use those lessons to move forward. That's a healthy way of doing things. We see a same kind of fight happening here in the United States when it comes to this country's legacy about race. For the first nearly 100 years in this country, human beings owned other human beings. Whoa, that's a problem. So what do? We put our fingers in our ears and say, no regrets, no regrets. Oh, no. I'm only positive. I only look forward. No, we say, you know what? We have to confront it. We have to acknowledge it. We have to disclose it, draw lessons from it to move forward. And I think that practice on a collective level is incredibly important. I think it's a foundation for a healthy society.
One more question that I just want to ask you, somewhat for selfish reasons, but a little bit because I think it actually potentially does connect to Yom Kippur, which is the question about connection regrets. Because I think that's what I was quoting relentlessly last year to my kids, to the point of they were so annoyed, where I was saying that I think what I learned in your book was that, so many people have a regret that they've fallen out of touch with a certain person, with a certain friend. The connection to Yom Kippur is, I'm thinking maybe people could feel that way about God or whatever secular vision of that we want to have, greater purpose, that you've kind of fallen out of that relationship, and that if you try to contact that person again, they'll be angry or they'll be, not open to it or whatever. And it turns out that they're almost always thrilled to hear from you and want to rebuild that relationship. I'd love it if you could just talk a little bit about that and about.
So one of the big categories of regrets, exactly as you say, are these connection regrets, where there's a relationship that was intact or should have been intact. It comes apart. It usually drifts apart. It doesn't always, not that often, comes apart in dramatic ways. Exactly as you say, somebody wants to reach out, but they say it's going to be awkward if I reach out, and the other side's not going to care. And the reality is that it's always way less awkward than they think, and the other side almost always cares. And so if there's a lesson to extract from that, it's if you are ever at a I say this myself, if I'm ever at a juncture now where I'm thinking, should I reach out or should I not reach out? Being at that juncture has answered the question, always reach out. I think that's one of the easiest takeaways from this entire body of research and from this book. I don't even know if I have anybody in the database, maybe one or two, who regret having reached out. Meanwhile, I have thousands who regret not reaching out.
I'm sitting with that and thinking about the extent to which it does or does not layer on to Dan Liebenson's part about losing connection to God or losing connection to Jewish institutions or synagogue. That's not a person that you've lost touch with. That's something I'll be thinking about this high holiday season is
But I think if someone has that impulse, okay, there are people who you lose touch with. Let's say there are people who you lose touch with, and you're like there is a kind of a planting and pruning of our friendships and our relationships. But if you feel that thing, oh man, I kind of miss that. So if you feel that way about a synagogue, if you feel that way about a religious faith of any kind, I think it's a healthy impulse to reach out, not to ignore that.
So for a long time, one of my favorite quotes in any pop culture material it's mattered to me for decades, and I've never had much of a reason, but in the Mighty Ducks movie, in the Mighty Ducks trilogy, there's an incredible moment where the main character, the coach, Gordon Bombay, is reflecting on how he messed up on a penalty shot years ago. And he says to Charlie, who's like an 8 or maybe not 8, he's a young kid who's on the hockey team. He says, I hit the post a quarter of an inch. If I just a quarter of an inch, and I would have made that penalty shot, and we would have won the game and the championship. And Charlie responds immediately, but coach, a quarter of an inch the other way, you would have missed entirely. And that quote has been in my guts forever. It's just always stuck with me that you should focus not only on what you didn't quite achieve, but what you did achieve. Your book, I think, in many ways is the Gemara, the commentary on that quote that has been very crucial for me. So thank you so much, Daniel Pink, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
What a pleasure. And who knew that the Mighty Ducks trilogy was this robust example of counterfactual thinking?
Well, without going into all the details, I will just say that the Mighty Ducks trilogy is a robust example of all sorts of things, and I clearly haven't done enough shout-outs to this iconic trilogy on the podcast. There'll be more at some point in the future, don't worry. But with that, we're going to close this episode out. Thank you all so much for listening, and we hope that you'll stay tuned and listen to more episodes in the future. As we close, a quick reminder that Dan mentioned this at the top of the episode, but we've got an amazing Hakel event coming up, this Sukkot gathering on October 12th, that is going to be a chance to engage deeply with all 5 books of the Torah. We're going to be reading out them in their entirety, and you'll be able to sort of be a real-time contributor, real-time commentator on the text if you come to our Zoom room during the day. And then we're going to have a culminating event in partnership with Hazon the evening of October 12th. That's going to be super awesome. You can sign up at bit.ly/Hakel2022. That's bit.ly/HAKHEL 2022. So we hope that you'll come to that. We want to close out this episode in the same way that we always do by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. Second, you can go to our website, judaismunbound.com. And third, you can hit us up via email at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. We also, of course, appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way, especially this time of year as we start a new Jewish year. And you can do that on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift via judaismunbound.com/donate. The last thing that I will say as our non-Shemitah year theme song comes in just a few seconds for the first time in over a year, although it started this episode too, but the first closing part of our episode in over a year, I will just say that support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.